Professor Dworkin, welcome back to the CEU. It was exactly 15 years ago, almost by the day, that you gave another public lecture in this very room, concluding a series of seminars at the Political Science Department at the time. You have spoken about hate speech and how a political community that values and respects freedom of expression should deal with it. That talk coincided with the beginning of a public political controversy in this country about the scope and value of freedom of expression, and it was extremely instrumental in giving structure to that discussion. Your present visit, related to the 10th anniversary of the philosophy department, coincides with another public political debate in this country, a debate on the future of democracy in Hungary. Our post-1989 republic undergoes a deep crisis. That crisis is not a recent development. The erosion of the constitutional system was well underway over the previous decade, but it received an alarming boost at the parliamentary elections as of last year. The collapse of the left allowed the party now in government to gain an unprecedented majority. And with that majority at hand, that party is mounting a fierce attack on individual rights, liberties, on the rule of law, and on constitutional checks and balances on executive power. Now the outcome will be decided in the political arena, not in philosophical discussion rooms, crowded as they should be. But the philosophical argument, nevertheless, has a point. It matters. It matters because it helps us better to understand the stakes of the political contest. And it matters because that contest itself is in part on who decides how the public will understand the stakes. Some argue, well, democracy is majority rule. In a democracy, the majority has the final say on everything. We may not like the decisions the majority takes through its elected representatives, but those are legitimate decisions, and there is no standard of legitimacy higher than the majority will. This is a fairly popular view in Hungary and elsewhere. It found its way into the academia as well, as you know. So it requires a careful analysis and a serene answer. We need to form a clear idea on what reasons we have to value democracy. What properties make a system democratic? And where is the proper place of majority decisions in a democratic system worthy of that name? These are different questions, but they are not independent of each other. They actually represent inseparable, different aspects of one single question. That question asks what democracy is. Professor Dworkin, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. What wonderful introductions. I'm very grateful. If John Shattuck wasn't such a young man, I might be worried about the length of his memory. And what he and Janusz have said puts me in mind. I'll try and tell this story quickly. It puts me in mind of what a very great judge for whom I worked once said. One day in his chambers, he said to me, "Do you think much about what heaven is like?" I said, "No. Would you like to know what heaven is like?" "Yes," I said. "Ah," he said, "I will tell you. At heaven, every night, there's a wonderful dinner party, and the conversation is unimaginably good, given who is at the table." Epigram follows epigram in a crescendo of wit and elegance until a voice is heard to cry out above the din, "Shut up, Voltaire, I want to hear what Hand is saying." I'm grateful for the chance to speak above the din. I'm very aware of what Janusz said about the contemporary problems here in Hungary, and these are very much noticed in the newspapers that I read in other countries, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, and so forth. But I do not feel, after such a quick acquaintance, that I am sufficiently aware of the details of your present government and its political standing to talk at length about this very government. Instead, with your indulgence, I'm going to tell you an imaginary story. And I'm going to ask the question, is the story that I will imagine the triumph of democracy or its ruin? The story begins with a country which has painfully, emerging from terrible periods of tyranny, established what looks like on the way to a mature democracy. It has free elections with near universal suffrage. It has a free and independent press representing diverse opinions across the range of the political spectrum. It has a constitution which embeds fundamental rights of individuals against the majority. It has a constitutional court active, indeed from time to time zealous, in its enforcement of this Constitution. The Constitution itself is regarded as a fundamental law, and it provides that it cannot be amended except through a vote of 2/3 of the Parliament. Then one day, this rather agreeable story is broken by the election of a government which, through a large majority, but also through the structure of districting, does elect 2/3 of the Parliament and sets about to change the character of the nation. It enacts a press law establishing a council whose members are entirely appointed by the government with the power to determine on its own that an article in a journal is offensive or derogatory of the nation, and to impose serious, indeed punitive, fines in so doing. It enacts that law in spite of the fact that the law is patently unconstitutional. It enacts other unconstitutional laws, for example, in violation of property rights in pension funds. It changes the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, again, by parliamentary vote, in order retrospectively to validate its unconstitutional legislation. Worse, it proposes to call a constitutional convention thoroughly to rewrite the Constitution so as to solidify its own power. Is this the triumph or the ruin of democracy? The case that it's the triumph of democracy was signaled by what Yanis said in his remarks a few minutes ago. Legitimacy in the modern world means democracy. Democracy means government by the people, or rather government by a majority of the people. Let me add one further fact to my imaginary story. The government which has enacted this legislation, the government which seeks to impose these radical changes, was and remains popular. This may be a departure from any story you know, but I'm imagining it, remains popular and would be elected with an even greater majority if an election were called today and held in 3 months. That is the triumph of democracy. What the people want, the people have. If the government, their government, allowed unelected judges in a constitutional court to deprive them of what they want, if the government in that way yielded to history and convention, then it would have forfeited its democratic legitimacy because it would have ceased to give the people what they want. That's the story of majoritarian democracy. And I ask again, is that really the triumph of democracy? It depends, as Yanis said, on what we should mean by democracy. I imagine just now a concrete account of what democracy is. It's government by majority. That is a procedural matter. Government by majority may be unjust. It may be unfair to a minority, but it's nonetheless democratic. And that's important because it means that if we want to correct the injustice as we see it, then we must do so in democratic politics. We must argue with the people to try and change enough minds to make a difference. And if we were to sponsor the idea that a panel of unelected judges should do that job for us, then even if in that way we achieve greater justice, we would forfeit legitimacy. That is the majoritarian conception of democracy. I suggest an alternate conception of democracy, which I would call the partnership conception. This argues that a democracy is government by the people as a whole, acting as partners in a joint venture of self-government. That sounds a bit woolly, doesn't it? I'll try and make it clearer later. But what I propose to do is to ask which of these two conceptions of democracy, one of which would endorse what my imaginary government has done, and the other of which, as I'll try to show, would condemn it, which of these two is superior as a conception of democracy? What kind of a question is that? Well, it plainly isn't a question we can answer by looking in a dictionary for the word democracy. It isn't a question we can answer in the fashion of some philosophers who seek to unpack a concept by discovering the hidden rules that people follow when they apply that concept. From Beijing to Caracas, from Minneapolis to Moscow, people call their own form of government democracy, in spite of the fact that there are great differences. They use different tests to identify democracy, and we get no place by asking what are the shared tests. There are no shared test. So I suggest a different methodology, indeed, a different philosophical project. This begins in the idea that some of our concepts, democracy, justice, liberty, law, some of our concepts are contested, or as I prefer to say, interpretive concepts. I mean, we share those concepts, they live in our lives. They live in the forms of life, as Wittgenstein put it, that we inhabit as values. And we share the concept because we share the idea that these are values, but we disagree as to exactly what values they are. There are values in that neighborhood, we agree. We strive to make our governments democratic, but we disagree as to what that means, and our disagreement is therefore a disagreement about value. It's a disagreement about democracy because it's a disagreement about much else. It's a disagreement about dignity, about justice, and much else. So I suggest to you that the way we proceed to choose between our two model conceptions of democracy, or others that you might wish to propose when we discuss these matters together, we proceed by asking, what's good about each conception? What would recommend choosing one conception over another? And that means that we can't confine our attention to traditional accounts of democracy. We must look to see what other values we can suppose that would lead us to designate one conception of democracy as better. I'm going to start with what I've called the majoritarian conception, because as Janis said, that's very familiar. There's a great deal of academic support. So I want to ask, what's good about the idea that when a political community disagrees about what to do, its leaders should follow the view of the greatest number of people? Why is that a good thing to do? What recommends it? The supporters of this conception would have a very quick answer. It's a fundamental principle of fairness. When a group, not just a political group, any group, has to make a collective decision, when it has to decide what a group should do rather than individuals, and the group disagrees, it is a fundamental, inherent principle of fairness that the largest number should be followed. And that designates the majoritarian conception of democracy, because that's only the application to politics of a more fundamental, very basic principle of fairness. But when we look again, we find that this isn't a general principle of fairness at all. We very quickly think of situations in which the fact that the greater number favors a decision of one sort or another counts morally for nothing in its favor. A case I like to use to make this point is the case of the overcrowded lifeboat at sea. One person must be thrown overboard in order to save all the rest. How do we decide? The worst way, or practically the worst way, would be to take a vote, because that would mean that the least popular, perhaps a member of a disliked race, would be chosen. The choice would be made on the basis of grounds that really have nothing to do with the decision to be made. No, we would prefer a lottery or some other method that makes it a matter of chance rather than a matter of popularity, who lives and who dies. And we see that in politics as well. When nations used to fight wars with conscripted armies, the question arose, who should be drafted to fight and perhaps die on a foreign field? And nobody thought that there should be local votes to choose this. It was thought that the only fair way to do it was by lot or by a test of who would be the best soldier or some other fact. And the consideration that a great many people in a particular village wanted X to go and fight would be morally irrelevant to the selection. Now, I want to make clear, saying that a majority vote is never appropriate in politics. Of course it is, very often. Very often it's the only defensible method of choosing. So far, I mean only to say that it is not because there is a fundamental principle of fairness that says that's always the way to decide. If that is the right way, I should rather say when that's the right way to decide in politics, it's because there are other considerations which in those circumstances make it the right way. It's not a fundamental principle that's always applicable. Well, what else can be said? There is a version of an argument in the political science literature that says that democracy is best because majority vote is best because the greater number are more likely to find the truth about what should be done. People who make this argument appeal to a mathematical proof by a French philosopher, mathematician, Condorcet, who showed by demonstration that if each individual person in a group has a greater than 50% chance of being right about some matter, then the view of the largest number is more likely to be the correct view. The premise, however, that each person is more than 50% likely to be right about a matter of political morality is hardly self-evident, and I put it to you that history shows exactly the opposite. There are other arguments. People say majority rule gives us political stability. If a majority is pleased by a decision, there's less likely to be any kind of insurrection or friction within the community. Again, that hardly discriminates between the majoritarian and the partnership conception. Partnership conception, which says everyone must be treated as having an equal stake in the decision, seems to me at least as likely to give stability to a political community. Consequentialists say the right decision is just a matter of what will please most people, because justice consists in the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That's highly contestable. I think it's wrong. But even if it were right, majority vote is not the best test of what's conducive to the greatest happiness of the greatest number, because majority vote doesn't take into account the intensity of a preference or the degree to which people will gain or suffer. It just counts heads. Well, now, I suggest to you that we have cleared away a number of arguments that people might make as to why there's any moral virtue at all in majority vote. But I've left the argument which seems to me the strongest, and has indeed seemed to people generally the strongest, and that is this. One of the essential virtues of legitimacy in the modern world is political equality. Each person must be thought to have and provided with as much power over a collective decision as anybody else. It's hard to manage equal power over a large political community, but majority rule plainly comes closer than any alternative would do, because majority rule just means everybody's got the same power, and we see how adding together equal power leads to a vote. If we were to take the view of a minority, obviously, political equality would be compromised. We need, at this point, to focus on the concept of political equality. What does it mean? When are people in a political community equal? We can distinguish two answers to that question, and they lead to very different results. One is equality of political impact. Your political impact is measured as the difference that you can make just by your vote or choice alone. We have to distinguish that from political influence, which is the difference you can make, not just by the impact of your own vote, but because of your influence over the way other people vote. And these are plainly very different matters. Now, once we've made that distinction, I would suggest it seems irresistible that political influence is more important than political impact. How can I say that I have equal political power to, in the United States, a billionaire who gives money to political campaigns, or to a sports hero, or to a television personality, or to a charismatic preacher? All of these people have dominant, exponentially more influence than I do, because others will do what they suggest to do. So we should accept that political equality means equality of influence. But as soon as we say that, we see that if that is so, political equality is not a desirable goal. Yes, we want money not to matter as much as it does in my country, but we want other things to matter. We want a great preacher like Martin Luther King to have influence in the civil rights movement. We want moral leaders. We want brilliant statesmen and moralists to have a greater influence. If we were to set out to make everyone's influence in politics the same, we'd have to forbid speech altogether, because with speech comes influence and differential influence. So after all, we have to turn back to equality of political impact. But as soon as we say that, then we see that in anything larger than a small town meeting, equal political impact is absolutely impossible. Representative government means that some people, a few people, will have, again, exponentially more impact on decisions through their choice than you and I have. And this is true not just of elected people, but administrative appointees, people in charge of making economic decisions, for example, for the community, or judges in a constitutional court. Equality of political impact is impossible, and anyway, why should it matter? In a country the size of Hungary, the political impact of any ordinary citizen is so small that it can sensibly be rounded off only to zero. And if political impact is anyway infinitesimal, why should it be a major goal of political institutions to make that infinitesimally small impact equally infinitesimally small? Now, you may well have begun to think that my argument has gone out of control. I've gone too far. I seem to be challenging the very idea of political equality. Then why not dictatorship, if we can find a decent dictator? Why should we care? Everything I've said up till now is right. Why should we care about political equality? I distinguished two senses and said neither of them matter. Because we have a better idea of what political equality is. It's not mathematical. It's a matter of status. Political equality means each person in the community is regarded as equally important in two dimensions. What happens to that person is equally important. And that person's voice and opinion is equally demanding of attention. Now, that means that some denials of equality in the political process really are intolerable because they're assaults on dignity. When, in almost everywhere, women could not vote, there was no interpretation of that denial available except the assumption that their views were less worthy of attention. That was the only conclusion, the only kind of justification that could be available, and that's a justification that is outlawed by the idea of political equality. But there are many kinds of gross inequality in political impact that carry no such implication. For example, to repeat, representative government. The fact that we elect some people and then give massive power to them doesn't mean that the rest of us are challenged in our dignity or importance. It's simply a means of sensibly accommodating and seeking the goals that we all share. And that is also true, whatever else may be said about it, of a constitutional court. If justices end up with much more power, even though they're not elected, there is nevertheless, it may be a bad idea, it may be a good idea, but there is nothing in it that challenges political equality as a status, because there's nothing in the design of that institution which calls into question the dignity of any citizen. So political equality is indispensable, but political equality must be understood as a matter of equal concern and respect for people, not any striving over a mathematical equality of the impact, still less the influence they have in politics. I want to summarize the argument thus far, but mainly to make clear what I am not arguing. I am not arguing that the principle of majority vote has great importance, but must sometimes be compromised because other things like justice or individual rights are important. I'm arguing for a much stronger conclusion, namely that majority preference in and of itself has no value whatsoever. I've canvassed arguments, all those I can think of, that suggest why it has value, and I've found that none of them supports it. And when we come to discussion, I hope some of you will try to show me that I'm wrong. But I think, and to iterate that strong conclusion, we should reject the majoritarian conception of democracy because it doesn't state anything of intrinsic value. When it's appropriate because of something else. Now, I turn to the partnership conception. I said, rather glibly and even cryptically, that the partnership conception was a matter of self-government by a community acting as a partnership. Now, what do I mean? I have to take a step back into the history, a bit of history of political morality. When in the 17th century, roughly, there was a seismic change in political morality because the old principles of divine authority, or hereditary authority, were no longer satisfactory. Age of the Renaissance, beginning of the Galilean Revolution. The question became urgent. It became the modern question of political philosophy. What justifies coercive government? Obviously, coercive government, backed by the steel of police and army, is indispensable to civilization. But what could justify it? Why isn't coercive government, the might of the community, trained against an individual to coerce that individual? Why isn't that subjugation, subordination, a form of slavery? That is the question to which political philosophy has struggled to find an answer. It is the question that the long tradition, the long and honorable tradition of social contract theory tries to answer. The answer it gives is that coercive government is consistent with individual dignity because it's based upon the consent of the governed. Still, every form of social contract theory, if it really is an attempt to base itself on the consent of the governed, has failed and cannot be revived. There never was an historical contract by our ancestors, and even if there was, what's that got to do with us? The theory that we give implied consent to our government because we don't leave is now too ridiculous even to gather anybody to defend it without a smirk. The theory, the most sophisticated form of this theory is now the theory in our time, put most effectively by John Rawls, that government is based on hypothetical consent, what people would consent to if they were rational under certain conditions. But that's not an argument from consent, because a hypothetical consent is no consent at all, and the circumstances that a philosopher like Rawls has to imagine in order to say it would be rational consent have nothing to do with our circumstances. Now, Rawls doesn't mean to rely on an actual or hypothetical consent doing any important work. But that just emphasizes that consent is not an idea that we can any longer use to answer what I call the modern question: what justifies coercive government? A different tradition is formed on the idea that democracy is a legitimate form of government, indeed the only legitimate form of government, because democracy is self-government. We are governing ourselves. But that's an idea that so far only compounds the mystery. Clearly, government by majority is not self-government by everyone. Indeed, it isn't even self-government by members of the majority, one by one. Abraham Lincoln, at a very dark point in our Civil War, said that government must be not only for the people and of the people, it must be by the people. He was appealing to an assumption of self-government that has yet to be redeemed. Now, I think it can be redeemed if we think of action, what is genuinely action by a collective group. It's a question that has occupied philosophers a good deal in recent decades. The question of when it's right to say that a group is taking some action rather than an individual. It's not done by a majority of the group, But I suggest to you that it is done. We can sensibly think of self-government by a group if certain assumptions hold within that group, each for all the rest. And these assumptions seem to me two in cardinal number. First, that everyone has an equal stake in a political decision, that everyone's fate matters just as much as anybody else's in that decision. You can't have partnership without that assumption. But secondly, that everyone enjoys equal respect within that association, and equal respect is a matter that requires, among other things, not just that each person have a vote, but that each person's opinion be deemed worthy of attention, respect in the sense of having a hearing. Those seem to me among, not exclusive, but among the dramatic requirements of anything that could be regarded as politics, as partnership, joint venture in self-government. Majority government does not supply either of these. If we want a partnership conception of democracy, we need more. What more? Plainly, you see I'm returning to my imaginary government, plainly, we need free speech, uninhibited free speech, and we need a free press, uninhibited and independent free press. To say, if we take seriously the idea that every opinion is entitled to attention and consideration, the only means of supplying that is an understanding that government may not decide what should be said or who should hear what. Free speech is the nerve of a partnership democracy. A partnership democracy also demands a structure. It demands a forum of principle in which partners who find themselves in the minority can challenge whether the requirements of association have been met. That is, whether their fate has been counted properly, whether their own ethical, religious, and political convictions have received freedom and attention, and that can only be done through a structure of government in which there is a forum of principle as a check on majority parliamentary decision. If free speech is the nerve of partnership government, judicial review and an independent constitutional court is, in my opinion, the essential skeleton. Now back to my imaginary government. I asked whether the government in my story had achieved a triumph of democracy. Well, it has on the majoritarian conception, but the majoritarian conception is so impoverished, if I'm right, that it gives that government no legitimacy at all. That government has set the country on the road, at least, to the ruin of democracy, because it has subverted the most basic principles that entitle a community to claim that it's a partnership of self-government. I told you at the start of these remarks about my judge, learned hand. In the worst days of the Second World War, Learned Hand addressed a large throng of people in Central Park in New York. He said, when the spirit of liberty dies in the hearts of men, no law, no court, no constitution can put it back. I think that's true. But there's something we have to add, which is that when the spirit of liberty still lives in the hearts of men and women, then law, courts, and constitution are the indispensable oxygen, indispensable to keep that flame of liberty still alive. Thank you.